All right, welcome. We're going to get started. My name is Nestor Davidson, and I'm the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs here at Fordham. And on behalf of Dean Matthew Diller, who unfortunately had to be in California today, or he would not have missed this for the world, I welcome you all to Fordham Law School. So we are gathered this evening to celebrate one of our leading lights, the incomparable Karen Greenberg. On the very happy occasion of the publication of her phenomenal new book, Rogue Justice, The Making of the Security State. As we will hear much more over the course of the evening, Rogue Justice grapples with some of the most important questions our legal system faces today. How to preserve civil liberties and the rule of law in an age of terror, and what the 15 years since 9/11 have brought us. This is a story Karen tells with craft that starts in darkness and ends with a real and, to me, when I read it, surprising ending of a note of optimism. It's a really, really wonderful book, and I commend it all to you, and congratulations. Now, you all know Karen's many accomplishments, building a center with a global reputation that stands at the center of debates on national security and the legal system, as well as the author of a bookshelf of important scholarship. But I just want to close by noting one other aspect of what Karen has brought to us here at Fordham that tends to fly a little under the radar as she gets all of the attention that she does. And that is how much Karen cares for and works with our students, something that is very meaningful to me. Every time I walk by the center, there are students busily working away on many, many research projects. There seems to be no end of work for our students. She's constantly finding ways to get them engaged. And many students have come and told me how valuable her career advice has been, as people are very interested in getting into national security as a career. And for that latter, I am particularly grateful. So please join me again in congratulating Karen on Rogue Justice and in thanking her for being such a valued member of the Fordham family.
Good evening. My name is David McCraw. I'm Assistant General Counsel at the New York Times Company. I think it's gone now. Sorry. Let me start that again. And I'm still David McCraw, Assistant General Counsel at the New York Times Company, for those of you who weren't sitting in the front row. And it's my pleasure to be moderating this discussion of Karen's new book. I was noting the dean's comments about all that Karen does with students. I was mentoring a student a few years ago who said, mentioned Karen by name, and I said I didn't know her, and I could see my stature in her eye just drop. How was it that I could be a New York lawyer dealing with issues like we're dealing with tonight, and in my case, First Amendment issues, and not know Karen? I haven't got that much smarter about national security since then, but at least I got to know Karen, which has been a delight and certainly has enriched my life. Karen, you know, I was looking at the Guardian review of your book in preparation, and the Guardian exactly gets it right when it says that it's a splendid new book about all the ways liberties was assaulted in America. I thought that was both a really good description of how good the book was and also what got there. But then, as is my wont, I started to look at the comments. And I noticed when I looked at the comments, this incredible line of commentary. This goes on for a while. This comment was removed because it didn't abide by community standards. This comment was removed because it didn't abide by community standards. This comment was removed because it didn't abide by community standards. This goes on for about 8 in a row. And then you finally get somebody who says, we've not had a global war on terrorism for the last 15 years. We've had a global war of terrorism. And then somebody says, you need to learn history, not Russian propaganda. And then we go back to abusing community standards and being deleted. So my question to you is, what is it about this topic that makes people violate community standards, the nutters on The Guardian, as well as sane people. Why is this topic so provocative?
I don't remember that in the list of questions. That
No,
you
I thought I was sorry, but I thought it was a softball, so go for it.
You know, I've actually asked myself that question, and this may not get to what you're asking, but let me give it a shot, which is that because the conversation so quickly was into two camps, you know, those that were on what was called the liberty side, those that were on the national security side. Because that happened so quickly and became like a symbol of identity for individuals, deep inside, every single one of us on each side of this knows that the other guys have a point. Like, as a person who embraces the First Amendment issues and the other, you know, constitutional issues and the respect for legality, deep inside, I know that there is something to we have to make ourselves more secure. And those guys on the other side, the dozens and hundreds of whom I talked to for my book and that, you know, I've talked to over the years, they know. They know they overstep the bounds. They know that they're digging their heels into something that's not truly defensible in the kind of rigid way they're defending it. So that would be my answer. I don't know if that's right.
Well, I looked at you, but I sensed what was going on there. In the first part of your answer, people were going like this, and in the second part, people are going, so, but let's, you know, the one question that you and I first talked about, which I wanted to bring up here, which is where did you start? I mean, when in looking at this, when you started, what was it you hoped to do, and what did you hope to find, and did you end up in someplace different?
I did end up in someplace different. I ended up angrier than I had started. I thought that I would write a book. I wrote this book in part because of Eric Holder, something that happened when Eric Holder got up and said to the country, we're not going to have the 9/11 trial here. We're going to take it back to Guantanamo to the military commissions because Congress has defeated me in this. And I remember looking at him, and this was, 10 years into the war on terror, and thinking, where have you been for 10 years that you think this is about Congress? This is about the courts giving up their proprietary sense. This is about people deferring to, in all parts of government, deferring to the executive time and time again. This is about taking your eye off what really mattered in this country in terms of justice for so long that, of course, this can't be tried here because our courts are broken, our way of understanding how we go about our regular business is broken, and it wasn't just Congress. That was like the last piece of the story. So I started the book as a way of saying, I'm going to explain this. I'm going to tell you what happened so that by the time we got to that announcement, it was inevitable that that was going to happen at that moment in time. So that's the first part of your question. Okay. The second thing I learned was that it was it was a worse story in some ways than I had known, because the more I dug, the more I saw that there had been individuals along the way who had done two things. Either they had closed their eyes, and this I found out in my first book on Guantanamo too, either they had closed their eyes to what they kind of knew was going on, but they didn't want to just go that way. They had a job to do and they were going to do it. Or they tried to fix it and couldn't fix it and kept their mouths shut about it. And so there was a lot of implicit knowledge about what was going on that was outside norms of what we would expect in this country. And I didn't quite realize how deep that was until I did this book. And the other thing I learned in doing this book, which I kind of knew before, was that there are a lot of people who are really sorry for what they did. And they're not going to ever say it in public, and I'm certainly, it's not my job to do that, but I believe it. I believe that they just got themselves into a situation where, as human beings, they didn't do the right thing, and once they hadn't done the right thing, the only thing left for them was to go home, and a lot of them just went home, and we haven't heard from them again. And they had powerful positions. And so that was another thing that kind of, when you're just talking to somebody and they sort of just like start to confess to you, you're like, okay. Now, they could have been playing me, but who knows? That surprised me.
There were a lot of Catholics. No, that confession thing. Don't underestimate it. But you say anger. I mean, what you more than virtually anybody in the room followed this as it happened over 15 years. Why does it come to anger
Because until you really look at the whole picture, you don't see where the moments are that it could have been stopped. For example, in the early September 25th memo of John Yoo to David Chris, that memo, which is about surveillance, says, yeah, you can do what you want. You can you can lower the standard for FISA, which we can get into if you want. But by the way, as long as we're talking about this, let me just tell you what else you can do. You can have warrantless surveillance on anybody you want, and because the calculus had changed. And half of the memo was about that. Now, David Chris had a job. His job was to get the wall, get FISA to a point where he could sell the Patriot Act the way he wanted to sell it, in a way that he thought was legally viable and that they've been talking about in the White House, in the old administration and in the Bush administration. But it would have been good if somebody who saw that memo said, we really don't want to have this out there. Why don't we say that this memo being written at this time, let's just take the part that answers the question asked and not open up this box that we just opened up here. Because if you really think about it, what else was approved in that memo became the secret surveillance program that nobody in the country knew about until Edward Snowden. And so, just to give you a sense. So there are moments, and that makes you angry. There are moments, there are moments when Michael Hayden, of all people, head of the NSA, head of the CIA, says, we can't do that. That's illegal, right? And they do it anyway. So there are just moments where you're just like, no, please don't do this. And so that would be an example. But I could give you a lot of examples.
And I was struck by that. There was this incredible paragraph in the book where you talk about that, pivoting off Cheney. For every Cheney mongering fear and nurturing paranoia, boy, that is an incredible sentence. Let's do that one again. For every Cheney mongering fear and nurturing paranoia, there are many officials quietly going about their business, drafting legislation, writing legal opinions, arguing in court, thinking they are doing the right thing, but failing to grasp that in their wish to protect the country, they are in fact betraying it. And in no part of the government has that betrayal by accretion, the death of liberty by 1,000 cuts, been more momentous or more disturbing than in the institutions of justice, the courts, the laws, and the Justice Department. And that's kind of what you're getting at, right? And I guess as I read that and tried to place myself in positions where I've been asked as a lawyer to do things, isn't that to be expected, though? I mean, especially after 9/11, weren't they really just reflecting what was going on in the broader country?
Yes and no. I would put a time limit on it. I would say for 18 months. For some reason, that's always been the cutoff in my mind. There is some period where you can say, oh my God, look what happened on 9/11. Thousands of people died. We weren't expecting it. We didn't know what we were doing. We were caught unawares. Our professionals didn't do what they were supposed to do. Let's do everything we can to stop this. But at some point, you start to get your balance again. And at some point, you have to look at yourself and say, whoa, wait a minute. We need to rethink this. We need to rethink what happened. We need to rethink how we want to respond. And just remember, that 18 months was essentially the beginning of the Iraq War. So rather than say, okay, we had our moment, we've had our grief, let's think about how we go ahead. We're like, no, we're going to double down on this because this is a political issue as well as any other kind of issue. And so, that's my answer to
So, speaking of resetting and rethinking, when we were talking the other day, you mentioned that I had sort of elided over Guantanamo when I first was talking about the book, and I want to go to Guantanamo, if you might, because that's one of those reset, rethink, and how did it work out moments, I think. And today's news, of course, this weekend's news was that you now have, in KSM's case, that his lawyers are challenging Judge Paul and accusing the judge of conspiring with the prosecution to destroy evidence, a really serious charge in any court, and particularly in this one when so much else has gone wrong. And it took me back to something you cite in the book, which is Obama's speech at the National Archives in May of 2009. He says it's time to reset, rethink. And he says there that the previous administration made a series of hasty decisions based on fear rather than foresight, and the country as a result off course. Sitting here today, what's the next president, what is she going to say about Obama and Guantanamo?
My guess is, given who the she is, that what she's going to say was that he did everything in his power to do what he could have done and give him a pass.
And you would say?
I would not say that. I would say that this was an individual who missed the mark, whose timing was off, who, when he gives that speech, the National Archives speech, a few months into his presidency, among the options he lays out is indefinite detention. You can't honestly talk about closing Guantanamo and say you're going to keep indefinite detention without charge or release. Those are completely contradictory statements. Guantanamo is about indefinite detention. And so the minute he accepted that, I think that's when the ACLU did their ad about morphing Bush's face into Obama's, quite rightly. It was a line in the sand for a lot of us, and it hasn't changed. And so he actually screwed it up in those original 4 months by a lot of things, or maybe the original 6 months, including deciding to return to the military commissions, which he had put a stop to. So, yeah.
But what was interesting, I think, is his terms there, that he said the prior administration, the Bush administration, had reacted to fear rather than foresight. Is that the same criticism? Is it still fear?
With Guantanamo, I think that perhaps when you talk to Congress, they are using fear to sort of make closing Guantanamo as impossible as they can or as difficult as they can. I'm not sure I think that that's where Obama's coming from or a lot of the people who are involved in government. I think that the intractability of Guantanamo requires such bold acts at this point, which we're starting to see, and which I think we're going to continue to see, that it wasn't about fear of terrorism. It was about fear of the political repercussions of what would happen. But when Bush did it, the fear was about terrorism. But when Obama got into office, it was just such a mess, and there were so many issues that he had to deal with that he was just afraid of all the different political issues.
You know, in broad strokes, I see one of the real strengths and beauties of the book is that you take what I think of as kind of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse: the Guantanamo in detention, torture, surveillance, and ultimately we get to drone strikes and targeted killing. And you are able to find a common theme through all of those things rather than deal with them discreetly. And you sort of have reconstructed the narrative, because what happens, of course, in 2015, we find out what happened in 2011, in 2012, we found out what happened in 2009. It's a very confusing narrative. And I want to get back to that. Before I do that, though, I wanted to ask about John Walker Lindh, because he doesn't represent very clearly any of those 4 big themes, but he comes up early and often in the book. What do you make of it? What does it contribute to your narrative? Why is he important to this story?
That's a good question.
I told you I was going to ask you that.
No,
It wasn't a surprise.
but then I thought we discussed it, and I was all like, okay, I bored him, so that, like, no. John Walker Lindh is, for me, one of the iconically symbolic people in the war on terror. I don't see him as you do as separate from these issues. In fact, in some ways, I see him as the doorway to our mistakes, and on a number of levels. One is that if you actually understood who John Walker Lindh was, you would understand radicalization in this country in a way we've yet to understand it. He is a very unusual case of a young man who in his teens decided he was alienated, he was an outsider, he was homeschooled, he was lost. And he found some sort of feeling of identification with Islam and their welcoming him. And imagine walking the streets of San Francisco in a long white outfit when you're 16 years old. He was making a statement. He went to Yemen, he went to Pakistan, he ended up fighting with the Taliban before 9/11. Understanding him, our inability to understand him and to pay attention to what happened to him and to use him when he came home in a way to enlighten us, I think is a big mistake. The way we treated him, he was an American citizen who we tortured while we interrogated him. We never expected to find an American in the battlefield of Afghanistan, let alone the first one, essentially. Showed us what we were willing to do to others in the United States, outside the United States, and finally, we didn't try John Walker Lindh, and everybody's always said, oh, yeah, 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 and every prosecutor, defense attorney, they all tell me, oh, that's fine. But you know what? If we had tried him, we would have known a lot of things. We would have known what we did to our own. We would have known the narrative of 9/11 and Al-Qaeda much earlier than we actually were going to get it. And we would have done, and we would have relied on our criminal justice system and not said, you know, when something just doesn't seem right and there's a clash between justice, liberty, and security, let's just sweep it under the rugs, call it a day, give him a better deal than he would ever get if we went to trial, given that it's post 9/11. And I think it did a disservice to the country in terms of the sense of strength in our own system and the way it worked. So I see him as tied to all of this, actually, not to none of it. Yeah.
So let's talk about the courts, and 'cause you bring that up as the alternative. And much of the blame in the book gets laid at the feet of people in the Justice Department and justice. I had a hard time sort of discerning what it was you were saying about the courts, because in one sense, you seem to place a lot of faith in it, and you talked about pivoting with Holder when Holder decides it's not going to happen. But I guess my sense is that the record of the courts in these cases was not that great. Am I misreading that? If you look at, Padilla gets convicted on a very weak case. Day of deliberation, he's gone. Kalani gets convicted of one count out of the 285, but gets a life sentence as a result of that. I mean, did you come away hopeful about the courts and what the courts could have done?
Well, so okay, let me just try to say this, and then you tell me where we disconnect here, because my point was the courts should have risen to the occasion, and they didn't. And so the Padilla case is one example. The Moussaoui case is the big elephant in the room. The Kalani case is actually a case where the courts do rise to the occasion, and then they throw it away by the way they use the legacy of that case by using it as an excuse not to have the 9/11 trial. But my point was that every single time, with rare exceptions, in a couple of lower decisions, actually ACLU cases, where the courts get the chance to say, you know what, we're actually going to think about this national security thing, and we're going to be on the side of the Constitution and the laws, because that's kind of what our portfolio is. They don't do that. They say, if it's national security, we're not going to decide this. If it's national security, we're going to defer. If it's national security, we're going to trust the president. If it's national security, we're going to decide this, and we're going to punt and let some other court decide this. That, to me, is not a robust, confident, protective court system. And so maybe one of the things I learned in the book was how naive I was, but I don't think so. I think that the national security piece of this was what they used to bow out of the conversation. And so that's what I meant by the weakness. And when I say justice system, I don't mean just the Department of Justice. I mean the legislature, the Congress. I mean the Department of Justice, which plays a big role in a lot of what happened. And I mean the courts, which just ran away.
Well, I fear you're forcing me to do something I didn't think I would do publicly, which is maybe say something nice about the Supreme Court. So yes. I'm going to go for it.
Go for
because it does seem to me that the Supreme Court got it kind of right on habeas, got it kind of right on the military commissions, or at least 5 people sitting on the Supreme Court. Is that a vindication of the system?
It depends on how you want to narrate it. I would say that the Supreme Court stood in opposition to the rest of the courts in the country in terms of how they decided these particular cases. But just remember, we have a Supreme Court right now that may not function. I don't think these things are unrelated. I can't draw you the line, but yes, the Supreme Court hung in there. They did the right thing time after time, particularly in detention cases. Now look how strong our Supreme Court is. So there's something going on, and it's not good. And so yes, the Supreme Court did. You can go on record as saying how great they were. Go ahead.
I'll leave that to you. But I want to get back to Kalani just for a minute, because one of the really touching anecdotes, and I didn't ask you, I was going to ask you this, but I think you can still do it, is this scene that you talk about between Dr. Porterfield and Kalani. And could you just describe that, and then how that's important to the narrative?
So a lot of what got me to write this book is that, for reasons I have no idea what, I just decided to go to court and watch these terrorism cases over and over, because after Obama, particularly after Obama came into power, there were 6 or 7 truly terrorist incidents, as opposed to the ones from the past that were sort of like stings, et cetera, wannabe terrorists. And we had a number. We had the Times Square bomber. We had the subway bomber. They were serious. We had Abdul Muttalib. We had a lot of cases suddenly in the system all at the same time. And so either before or after that, I started just going to court. And sometimes took students with me and just case after case, watch them from beginning to end to see if I could make heads or tails of this. And then, of course, the biggest case of all, the Guantanamo case of Ahmed Ghailani comes. And this is, for somebody who watches these cases, just like, what? All of a sudden, one of the Guantanamo cases is coming here. We're finally going to see a serious case, a truly serious case where there's evidence that's been collected for years, where there's an indictment that's been out there for years that sort of defies the post-9/11 corruption of the system. And then he was tortured. And so the case is just destroyed from the very beginning in pretrial hearings over this issue of torture. And so there's 2 things about Kate Porterfield, who I have tremendous respect for, who works with these detainees and with others who have been subjected to trauma, such as torture. And there are 2 pieces of the story that, and I don't know if I know which one you meant, but I'm going to just talk about both of them. One is that Ghailani didn't want his team. He didn't want his defense team. He didn't trust them. Who would, right? And he'd been through, the military commissions. He'd been tortured at a CIA black site. Being brought to federal court wasn't exactly what he wanted. In a pretrial hearing, his lawyers argue to the judge, Louis Kaplan, who handled torture extremely well in this case, said to him, his lawyer said, look, he can't come to court. He's strip searched every time he comes. It releases a PTSD in him from how he was tortured at American Hands and CIA black site. He cannot come to court. He will be a mess. He cannot help his case. And something happened to Ghailani at that moment. And you could see it happen, where all of a sudden it was like, there are people here on my side. And Kate was one of them, because she testified about it. And so there was already a bond that was real from this part of the story. Then what happened was, and this is months later, the trial starts, and they have to pick a jury. And picking a jury in a terrorism case is not fun. And if you ever want to get some insight into it, go find one of the jury questionnaires. Like, what do you think about Muslims? What do you think about? So anyway, they start with hundreds of people on the jury, and they have not quite found the jury they're going to be with. There's a lot of potential jurors in the room. And Ghailani's brought into the courtroom, and he's cleaned up, and he looks young. He's one of those people that looks 20 years younger than he is, and he's young. So imagine. All right. So he's sitting there in the courtroom, and terrorists in this country do not get cut any slack. You're called a terrorist. It doesn't matter if you're a guy on the street who had some kind of ridiculous idea that was never going to work, or you're Ahmed Ghailani, who was accused of being involved in the embassy bombings, which killed 200 people. It doesn't matter. He's a guy who's accused of the embassy bombings. He comes in, and he's sitting at the table, and into the courtroom walks his military team, the team that he wanted to support him when he had that earlier incident. He said, I don't want my team. Right. He wanted his military lawyers. He had some kind of bond with them. And with his military lawyers walks in Kate Porterfield. And he turns around to her. And you see that they just have a connection. And it's real. And they care about each other. And that she cares about him. And that she sees him as a human being. And when you should have seen the people on the jury, potential jury, watch this incident. And it was like, all of a sudden, instead of being this cardboard terrorist, he's a human being who was in a courtroom against whom evidence would or would not be presented. And the whole thing, it was immensely interesting at that moment that you knew that this case was going to be different than any other terrorism case. And that's the incident you're referring to, right?
It was.
Okay,
it
good.
was. That was good.
Okay.
But I guess what I'm asking is the coda to that, because it's a dramatic scene in the book, and you write it so nicely. Is that the message the government got, though? Is that also a message the government got, not just jurors?
Yes. It's the message the government got, which is don't go there. Don't go into this courtroom. You do not do this. This guy was acquitted of 200, let me tell you how he was acquitted. He was acquitted of 283 of 284 charges. But the jury is not told what the penalty is, you know, what happens, what the sentence is for any, or sentence range for any kind of conviction. So they picked the least, if you're looking at the charges, you know, like damage to a building of you, it's the least of the lethal, none of the deaths, none of the, you know, none of the other things that if you were a juror and didn't know about the law, which there is a built-in ignorance into the system intentionally, so they gave him the least of the charges. And then the judge basically said afterwards, I don't care what this jury, at sentencing, I don't care what they thought. I'm telling you, I've looked at the evidence, I know you're guilty, and you're going to jail for life without parole. And it's a staggering moment when you're thinking about what is the criminal justice system actually all about.
Right. And Judge Kaplan had said before, though, that even if he'd been acquitted, he was still eligible for permanent detention.
When he made his rather groundbreaking decision that the evidence, which the government said was its main evidence in the trial, was not going to be allowed because the witness presenting it had been found through the torture of Kalani. In other words, it was tortured evidence, essentially.
Yep.
The judge said, look, that's not coming into my courtroom, which is a tremendous, unlike John Walker Lindh or any of these other cases, or Umar Sawi. He said, it's not coming in my courtroom. It's not happening. And therefore, I don't care if it's your most important evidence. It's not coming in. But anyway, don't worry, because if he's acquitted, you know, he'll go back to Guantanamo. But yes, he did put that in. But, you know, it's a little, we take what we can get.
Right. I mean, and I agree with you that it was really a striking moment to have someone charged with that serious terrorism down at 500 parole in a court where the daily business of the court's taking place. My very, very tiny role in that, of course, was that I was asked to make a motion to get the jury questionnaires released, and Judge Kaplan said, will you come down to Chambers and talk to me about it? Which I did, but when I arrived at Chambers, I pointed out there were about 16 reporters following me, and that maybe we wanted to go into open court, and to his credit, that's where we went. But, you know, it was that moment of sort of saying, this is no different than
What happened?
Well, some of the seated jurors released no names, I think, was the final, which is pretty typical. But at least you knew who they were and what their responses were. But what was striking to me was, and this kind of underscores the point you're making, was that this is no different than when I'm doing that in a mob trial, or I'm doing this in any kind of trial and trying to find out, you know, who are the people sitting in judgment here. Which morphs into the Holder's famous, to go back to where you started. You know, Holder says, you know, if we had done this, if we had these cases in civilian court, all of the 9/11 plotters would now be on death row, and this would be behind us. Do you believe that?
Absolutely. They might not be on death row, but yeah, most likely they would be. And there's no question that they would have been tried. They would have been tried. I doubt they would have, well, if they're for death, they're not going to plead. But yeah, they would have been tried. They would have been convicted. They'd be, you know, either on death row or in the supermax, whatever. Absolutely. Do you have any doubts?
Yeah, I guess I do.
Really? Well, let me hear.
No one came here tonight to hear me.
I now realize I should have interviewed you next time.
Right.
Okay,
We'll
okay.
go ahead and say.
Next book.
I think they'd be really tough cases. I think they'd be really tough.
Because of the torture?
Because of the torture, because of the evidence.
Do you think maybe they should try them for the Bojenka crime? That they could try KS? Does it matter that he's tried for 9/11 at this point?
Yeah.
It does.
Yeah. Well.
Or it doesn't.
I don't know. I'd have to think about that. Yeah. So let me, before I get into law, which I know nothing about, let's steer back to literature, which maybe I know something about despite my occupation. And the Guardian raises this too. Is this a book without heroes?
Well, actually, no.
The book without women.
That is not my fault.
Right. Well, but it may relate to the question I asked, but just before that.
Yes, because there's no women. Well, now I have to. That's a lot to. Okay, so it's not a book without heroes. There are some heroes. For one thing, Edward Snowden is a hero in this book. There's no getting around that fact. Like him or not like him, what he did for the country and for this story, the story I'm telling, was actually tell us where the story was going. and legitimize what so many people had thought was happening, but were told time and time again, ACLU most prominently, I'm sorry, you can't bring these charges in court because this is all secret, so you couldn't possibly know enough to bring them, so, that kind of solipsistic argument. So he's a hero. He moves the narrative along in a way that if we're ever going to recover in any way, which we're not going to recover fully, then it happened because of him. He's a hero. On a much lesser way, Don Verrilli's a hero. Paul Clement takes every football they give him. He's the acting Solicitor General and the Solicitor General, and runs down the court with it no matter what the Bush administration tells him to do, whether it's torture, detention, etc. He's gonna do what he's told. He'll go to the district court, he'll go to the circuit court. When he finds out about torture, when he says to the Supreme Court justices, well, we wouldn't torture people. And he goes home that night and he finds out that they've tortured people. We don't know anything from the New York Times or anything else about him saying, wait a minute, I said this in open court and this was not true. But when Don Verrilli finds out that the way surveillance was supposed to be done was not the way it was done, and the way defendants were informed about what happened, through this, and that these cases have not been litigated on fair grounds, he does something about it. He does something about it immediately and internally. And I would probably have more to say about him, but I didn't in the book. But I think he's a hero. I think the ACLU is the hero of the book. There's no question. I read it again the other day, and I was like, damn, that's unbelievable. Because I knew it, but they carried this message. They kept it alive. If they take them out of the picture, then what happens? And then the oddest hero, and this surprised me, and I know a lot of people don't like when I say this, but I'm going to say it anyway. Obama does some amazing things behind the scenes quietly. And I don't think this is an unintentional guy, and I don't think these were unintentional acts. And they had to do, believe it or not, with surveillance, which is the big issue when he comes in. And he is trying his best to put evidence and information in front of people that when they see it, will make sure there is a certain course of action that comes about. And that's what I think happened in part with surveillance, that his behind the scenes working and Snowden's, global headline, activity coalesced in some way. So those are my odd bedfellow heroes.
That is an odd bedfellows. We started talking about how routine people going about their jobs, thinking they're doing the right thing, and getting lost in course. And you and I have talked about the one person who probably fits that description who tried to do something was Jim Baker, right? And I don't want to get into is he a hero or not a hero, but could you just trace his narrative, what he does that makes him different?
He's definitely a hero.
He's definitely a hero.
I just forgot about that part of the book.
Okay, all right, okay.
He's definitely a hero. So, at least as I...
And he is, for those who don't know.
So Jim Baker was the head of the office. He worked in the Department of Justice prior to 9/11. He headed a very important office that oversaw foreign intelligence surveillance warrants. But he had a reputation for not allowing overreaching requests from law enforcement about surveillance to go through. In other words, he was, rigid and diehard about protecting the Fourth Amendment, and he just didn't stop year after year. And so when you hear that FISA warrants are always granted, what you didn't know was that Jim Baker, the reason that happened was Jim Baker tossed so many of them away. He was like, don't bring it here. Just don't bring it here. If this is really about that you want a criminal warrant, go get a criminal warrant, because it has a higher standard. And so Baker was known as they called him the wall, which meant that he preserved that wall between intelligence and law enforcement, which we won't go into because my editor will kill me. But he was the wall. And so what happened after 9/11, when they started to think about this issue, they started to think, wait, why didn't we know about these guys? Why didn't we know about Moussaoui, who they thought was the 20th hijacker? Why didn't we know about all of these things? It had to be this policy and this man who represented it. And so what they essentially did over 4 years of time was say, we're getting rid of this office. They didn't get rid of him. They got rid of the entire office. They said, you know, we're not going to have that office anymore. And what Baker did was he made these plaques, these plaques that said basically birth and death of his office, meaning birth and death of the Fourth Amendment, essentially, in the Department of Justice. And then and when you read about some of the documents that have come to light since then, what you find is that he really was fighting a behind-the-scenes attempt to do what other people have gotten a lot of credit for, deservedly. And what I find most, he's a really thoughtful person, but the most interesting thing about Jim Baker, and knowing this about him, and he was here at Fordham a couple of months ago for something, is that when Jim Comey, who is also somebody, now the director of the FBI, who's also somebody who discovered wrongdoing inside the Justice Department and did more than anybody to fix it, actually. Didn't fix it, but tried. And had the bravado that other people didn't have to at least try. When he became director of the FBI, lo and behold, forever else we might want to think about him, he hired Jim Baker as his general counsel. In my mind, that's a very big deal. And so I don't know how the word hero fits into all of that, but it's worth noting. It's definitely worth noting. Things are not just black and white.
Right, right. But before we take a few questions here and get to the end of the hour, I wanted to get to the end of the book because I was really struck by your last sentence, which poses the question whether we can have the courage to believe that what we cherish can see us through. It's a beautifully rendered sentence. But is that really, at the end, what the book is about, a lack of courage, a loss of faith?
Yeah. It's about
I thought you were going with no on that. I was worried.
Oh, I just was thinking, I like that sentence. I think it's very much about we don't realize what we've given up, that we have accepted a compromise that ultimately is not worth accepting, and that we are nowhere near reconstituting a kind of free space that we existed in and an expectation of justice. And yes, I do think it takes a lot of courage. And I'll tell you, I don't have that kind of courage, but I want everybody to have it. As a society, we could have it, and we don't. And so if you want to be somebody who's courageous, you have to be an isolated, brave person who's willing to take on punishment, rather than living in a society where there's collective courage, and so it's a lot easier to be in that space. And so that's what I think.
So with that, should we take questions from anybody? Yes, please. Yeah, the mic's coming around.
I haven't finished the book, but I kind of know where it ends. I think we all do, and where we are now. Looking at the next inauguration and looking at the past and seeing what executive powers could be used and how quickly they could be employed, what are your biggest fears for whoever becomes president, how quickly they can change things, like torture?
Yeah, my biggest fear isn't torture. My biggest fear is Guantanamo being kept open for ISIS. That is a huge fear for me. Don't ask me why, but Guantanamo has just captivated me, in every way since the day it opened. And I want it to close. I don't think it should be there. I think it keeps open possibilities that are far beyond just indefinite detention. Without Guantanamo, torture is a whole other thing, whatever word you want to call, abuse of all different kinds. As long as Guantanamo is open, there is very little chance for us remembering precisely who we are. So that's one big fear. The second fear is secrecy. We live in a government. This has not changed. We live in an administration now, an administration before, that's very secretive. Okay, so one was secretive about secret laws, and now one's secretive about other kinds of policy decisions. But we have not moved to that era of transparency that Obama promised on his second day in office. And so that may not sound like a national security issue, but that is a national security issue. So those would be the two that come to mind, and I'm sure when I go to bed tonight, I'm going to come up with the real answer, and I will call you and let you know what it is.
Yes, please.
Please share with us the process that you had in writing the book, and how many times did you revise your original outline?
Never. No, I didn't revise anything. It was just like pure. This book took the exact same amount of time to write as the other one. So I'm assuming that it's the same process. Whereas you write it once, you think about it, you give it to a few people, you write it again, whatever. The difference is that this book was heavily based on interviews. And there were some interviews that I didn't get until late in the process. And the book was also heavily reactive to what was happening. And so a lot of what went on had to do with rethinking things as what you said. A lot of documents just were dumped in my lap, like in the last 6 months of the book. The Stellar Wind document is, to actually take the time to put that together in chronological order and see what it said. So, those were the challenges.
Were people reluctant to talk to? Were there people who were reluctant to talk to you?
No, that's interesting. There was one person who said, "I'll never talk to you. Hell will freeze over." There's the only one person who said that, who wrote it. They did not say it. But what even much more interesting than not wanting to talk to me was they were so nice to me. They were so willing to talk to me, but not necessarily about what I wanted to hear about. Everybody talked to me.
So everybody in the room, buy the book and start figuring out who's not in there. Jamil, and then up front here.
So, Karen, your book is very generous to the ACLU, but at the same time, it's an account of one failure after another, right? And I'm wondering whether, when you wrote about this long, endless series of failed attempts to rein in the security state, whether you ever felt, I wish that the ACLU, or I wish that the media, or I wish that this actor had done things differently. And if only they had done things differently at that crucial point in time, this part of the story might have turned out differently. Did you ever have that feeling, or do you feel like, the media and civil society in general did what it was supposed to do, but actors in government didn't?
That's a really good question. Do I wish the ACLU, let's just name it, do I wish the ACLU had done more in certain instances rather than just go to court and say, okay, we're going to try in court, and then we'll try in court again, and we'll try in court again? Is that basically the question?
Yeah, ignore the media part of that question.
Yeah, now that I have you guys here. I think there are things that could have been done, but I don't think it would have mattered. Because the premise of my book, and I will definitely think forward about what you're, in the future about what you're saying, the premise of my book is the courts should work. The courts should protect us. And so the ACLU trying to get these things through the courts is what I think should have worked. So if there were things outside of that that would have made me happier, they wouldn't have made me happier about the system of justice, which I was really trying so hard to write about. But I'll try to come up with things you guys should have done that you didn't do, and the media too.
Thanks. Hi, my name is Miles. I'm a student at Columbia. And one thing I want to ask is, based on what you just said, it seems that your premise suggests that we should asymptotically approach but never encounter any sort of martial law. But I'm just wondering, I guess, from a student perspective, after these last 15 years of counterterrorism, what have we learned, and what is our new philosophy legally regarding the conditions for martial law? When should that ever be on the table, in your opinion?
So there are legal standards for that, but I think you're actually asking a deeper question, which, and you can tell me, if you are or you aren't, but I think the deeper question there, and that's a very disturbing question for me, because one of the things I think we don't think enough about as a country is what the last 15 years have been like for those of you who are your age. It's one thing for those of us who have tried to carry this ball and failed to restore a sense of balance. But what I hear in that question is, how scared should we be? And secondly, how scared should we be of our government? And I would say how scared you should be is not so scared. And how scared you because terrorism is not the biggest threat we face. It is not the biggest danger we face. It is not any of the things that so many people have made great capital on. In terms of your government and fear your government, which is what martial law feeds into, I also don't, I'm going to say, that we have to trust that the people who know right from wrong will do the right thing. But that's actually where we are as a country right now, trusting that the people who are supposed to rise to the occasion will. And so I think it's a responsible question, actually. But my message to everybody always is just don't be scared, because fear is just the thing that ruins it for ourselves. So that would be my answer.
Yes, please.
I can probably speak loud enough, but I'll use this mic. I wanted to know, Karen, as I said before, I love the book. I thought it was essential. I hope that everybody reads it and gives it to a dozen of their friends, so they can understand what's happened in this country over 15 years, what we have shouldered because we don't feel like we have a voice. And occasionally we're reminded, be afraid, be very afraid, because the terrorists are out there. I wanted to know your opinion on Snowden, if he will be given a pardon when the president leaves office. That's question number one, or opinion request. The other thing I wanted to put on the table was something that you said about, it's not a book about women, because there were no women there. And I think that it's important to understand because they have always been a symbol of weakness, softness. And the people that were making all of these decisions, I think, wanted to communicate that they were strong enough to do this. And then they surrounded them with people like with people like John Yoo, these brilliant minds who were going to enable them to be strong enough. And I think they didn't make decisions against some of the actions because they did not want to be perceived as being weak. And when Obama came into office, one of the first things that started to show up in the press and in interviews was that he was weak on this or weak on that. So it became very important for him from the start, I think, for him to show that he was strong enough to do this.
So Snowden and then
Yes,
Macho.
thank you.
Well, first, Janice, okay, I'm so embarrassed. So Janice Karpinski is one of the heroes, and come on, and we go way back. She was the first female battlefield general in the U.S. Army. She was, I'll say mistreated. I could pick other words. During the Abu Ghraib scandal, she has kept her dignity, her integrity, and so that's a hero. Thank you. I also want to mention there are women. One of the women is Condoleezza Rice, who famously did not let the information about 9/11 get to the White House. And so there are women. There's just, I don't tell that part of the story. So I just wanted to say that. Snowden, what do I think should happen to Snowden? What do I think will happen? Obviously, he's a hero of my book. I read in the paper today, because of what Holder's been saying, that there's a possibility that some kind of deal, well, this is your paper? That some kind of deal will be, cut. What's wrong with pardoning him? Is it really wrong with pardoning him? Sorry. What's wrong with pardoning him is that, you know, he exposed these tremendous weaknesses in our security system, as well as horrors about what we were doing to American citizen others. So that's my opinion on Snowden. And what was the other thing?
About macho and
Oh, yeah, the macho thing. Yeah, that's national security. We chose to be in it. You know, so what can I say?
Well, this is what I can say is that it is a book worth reading. Everybody who said kind things about it were not generous enough. Thank you for spending this time with us.
Wait. The thanks go from me to all of you for many people in this room helped do this book. I thank all of you. Thank you for coming. And let me thank David so much for doing this for all of us.
All right, thank you.